so linked into the intrinsic links between woods and people, I'm going to introduce Mike Carswell. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so I'm Mike Carswell. I'm originally from County Down, which is in Northern Ireland. That's where the letter A is there on the map. And I spent 14 years in England. I was apprenticed to Rebecca Oakes for 3 years, from 08 to 11, through the Bill Hogarth Trust in the Silverdale and Arnside, AOMB. That's where the letter B is there on the map. Mainly worked in restoration of neglected coppice and then conversion of existing woodlands to coppice, mostly on public sites, nature reserves, parks, etc. I ran my business for 10 years in Manchester, managing suburban woodland as the urban coppicer. That's where the letter C is there. You probably all know where Manchester is. That's that really wet city there around sea. And I came back to Ireland in 2017. I'm now based in Wicklow, which is where the letter D is there. Okay, so principles of coppice management. We're talking about broadleaf trees that are cut down to ground level, usually, but not exclusively, in winter, which then regrow with multiple stems. The stems are then harvested on a rotational cycle, the length of which is determined by the end use of the wood. So we're growing wood for a reason, for a use. It is logistically efficient wood growing system, and it works at any scale of land area, can be worked using human or animal powered methods or mechanized. So in the UK, most of Britain's native trees coppice, bar, for example, larch and Scots pine. Here in Ireland, all of Ireland's native trees coppice, bar Scots pine. And in Europe, most broadleaf trees coppice. So to avoid confusion, we'll call the trees that coppice broadleafed, and those that don't, either softwoods or conifers. So, for example, alder, which is a broad-leaved deciduous conifer, coppices. Yew and juniper, which are narrow-leaved evergreen trees, usually lumped in with the softwoods, they also coppice. Okay, so here we have some examples of the coppice cycle in progress here. So in the top left corner, you will see a hazel plantation. It's never been coppiced before. Contains hazel grows with multiple stems by default. So you can't assume that it was coppiced just because it has multiple stems. And then in the top right-hand corner, this is the same hazel being felled here. And you can also maybe make out some trees that are left not felled. We call those standards. They're left to grow on to mature for timber. Here in the bottom right, you see there's a different site, but this is an ancient woodland site in the southeast of England, a hazel coppice with oak standards. And all the little green bushes there are the coppice regrowing there. This picture was taken in July, following the previous winter when the felling was carried out. And then here in the bottom left, we have hazel that's ready to be cut again. And when it's ready to be cut, it will be cut again, just like in the top right, and then regrow again, just like in the bottom right. And in principle, this can continue indefinitely as long as it isn't mismanaged. Some other examples here from around the country, around the islands. Here in the top left, we have over-mature oak coppice. This is in County Wicklow in Ireland. Here we have sycamore coppice, about 40 years old here, also in Ireland. Despite being a non-native tree, it's still, if it's managed appropriately, it's still quite good for woodland flora. There's a very, very lush carpet of bluebells in this woodland. Here we have coppiced beech in the south of England, which hasn't been cut for a very long time. Quite an unusual species in the UK to coppice. Sweet chestnut here in the bottom right, one of the most important and most commonly coppiced species in Europe. economically very important, mainly because it is a durable hardwood, so it lasts outside. Hornbeam here in the middle, which not very commonly coppiced anymore in the UK, is still coppiced in other European countries, mainly for firewood. And in the bottom left here, alder. This photo is from Cumbria, and very commonly coppiced in the past, less so today, mainly used for charcoal in the past. It's a very strong contender, I would say, economically, to compete with softwoods for the like of pulp and pallet wood. So some terms in the subject. So the word coppice itself comes from the French verb coup or coupe, to cut with a blow. So coppice is the act of cutting down to induce regrowth, but is also the regrowth itself. A stool is the previously cut stump of a coppice tree, usually with multiple stems. The rotation or cycle is how long the coppice grows before being cut. The coupe or the cant is the area cut during each year of a coppice cycle. And a standard is a single stem tree left to mature for larger diameter timber, hence coppice with standards, which is when we have coppice and a high forest element of large canopy trees at the same time. So ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms in ecosystems. Economics originally meant the art of managing a household. So economics doesn't mean making money or managing money, it means managing a household. Sustainable means that which is perpetually enduring. So from a human economic perspective, this limits our consumption to materials that we can grow, i.e. natural or organic materials. And the word conserve, as in conservation, means to prevent change. Woodland management is a euphemism for cutting down trees, but not merely the act of cutting down trees, but more the decision-making process involved in cutting down the right trees at the right time for the right reason. The history of coppicing. So it is considered to be the oldest form of systematic and sustainable forest management, and was developed to supply rural communities and early industries with wood, mainly for fuel. In the early 20th century, the prevailing concept for the management of forests shifted to high forest. This was mainly due to a rise in the use of fossil energies, through which fuel wood became less important. So because we're burning oil and coal now, we don't need as much wood, therefore we're not managing our woods as much. There's still over 20 million hectares across Europe that are managed as coppice, while a much larger area originates from past coppice management. The timbers used in early Neolithic trackways preserved in peat bogs imply coppice management, some dating back to about 3900 BC. So we're looking at, potentially 6,000 years of coppice management in Europe. And then during the 20th century, the area of coppice woodland in Britain declined from 230,000 hectares to about 23,000 hectares, so 90% reduction. What effect does a 90% reduction have on the biodiversity of the UK? Well, this next slide here, we'll look at some graphs that show biodiversity decline over a similar period. So here in the top left, we have the decline in relative abundance of priority species in England from 1970 onwards. The top right, we have the reduction of about 31% since 1970 of woodland bird populations. On the bottom left, we have approximately 1,000 years of woodland decline in England, with then this interesting uptick during the 20th century, which is mostly the planting of conifer plantations. So not necessarily a massive increase in native woodland or even broadleaf woodland, but instead a massive increase in conifers. And then the bottom right here, we have the population of England over approximately 1,000 years. And the greatest increase starts once the Industrial Revolution really gets going. But what's really interesting about this area of history here from the 1800s through the middle of the 1800s is that this is also the largest increase of urbanization. So people leaving the countryside and going to work in industrial environment in urban areas. So the countryside became depopulated, urban areas become more densely populated, and the population increases. This massive population increase, though, is mainly as a byproduct of the consumption of fossil fuels rather than the consumption of sustainable resources. When we look at the economy, the forestry economy today, we see that it is mostly softwood. So here's two graphs from the recent forest statistics from Forest Research. And the one on the top left here you see is millions of green tons of softwood. So over the last sort of 40 years, it's mostly softwood. And then on the right, we have the hardwood element of it, which is much, much smaller. And this would be coming out of potentially out of native woodlands, but also out of non-native broadleaves as well. There's a massive ecological and biodiversity difference between these two types of tree cover. So how big an area of the Atlantic rainforest zone is taken up by non-native industrial forestry? And if afforestation is a priority, why would we plant fast-growing non-native conifers only to clear fell them several decades later? The answer is that industry demands it. If total area of tree cover is important, then surely slower growing species would provide more benefit in the long term. And a very important question here that I want you all to think about is, what wood products do we produce that cannot be made from native wood species? Everyone consumes things like paper, cardboard, pallets, toilet roll. It doesn't have to be made out of even conifers, let alone, spruce plantations. The conversion of conifer plantations into continuous cover forestry, otherwise known as thinning, is long overdue. But does this include native or broadleaf coppice systems that also provide habitat for native wildlife? It should. Does high forest, comprised largely of shade-tolerant trees, provide the required habitat for native wildlife? Can we have our cake and eat it? Can we have a healthy forestry industry and have good biodiversity at the same time? So we know a good thing by its results, and coppice woodlands can be compared to hay meadows in the sense that they generally end up with on average, a lower level of soil nutrition, which allows a wider suite of flora to exist there, rather than nitrogen indicators like nettles. It also can be compared with the intertidal zone, which is a consistent fluctuating habitat, although obviously not man-made. When we see an increase in biomass and an increase in biodiversity, generally we're onto a good thing. A conifer plantation shows us an increase in biomass, but a decrease in biodiversity, while it is growing, that is. So it's generally not good. It's only got half of the equation right. Biodiversity is a byproduct of high quality holistic land management. Coppiced woodland is famous for biodiversity due to the consistent cycles of light and shade, and the structural diversity created by having a full rotational cycle within a woodland. Complex structure and consistent cycles are more important than species mix. This biodiversity is a byproduct of the commercial management of woodland. Just like in a hay meadow, the biodiversity in the hay meadow is a byproduct of the commercial management of the hay. A quote here from Edlin's 1956 book: "The commercial harvesting of timber for use or sale is often considered a prime cause of the disappearance of forests, but it need not be, and under proper management it never is. The mere cutting of timber need not seriously harm the woods. What does the damage is the prevention of regrowth thereafter." So cutting down trees doesn't lead to deforestation. It's the prevention of regeneration that does that. And some of you who know this saying from Cumbria, if you want wood, you have to cut wood. So if you want to have a wood supply, you need to manage your woods. Reading a book, while important, is a secondary kind of literacy. The most primal and critical literacy is to be able to read your environment. This is what Indigenous people can do all over the world, is they know how to read their environment, even if they don't know how to read a book. It's not an academic subject, it's a practical one. If we want people to be able to manage woods and we want to have a sustainable resource of wood, we need to make sure that we have overlapping management between people and the ecosystem as well. So I call this the intergenerational continuity of management. In this diagram, you can see there's 4 different colored curves. The yellow curve here represents a hypothetical 25-year coppice cycle. Every time it is cut, it regrows. It is cut again and regrows, cut again and regrows, and so on through a cycle. The large green curve is the lifespan of a standard, like a mature oak tree, that is then harvested every 100 years. But every time the coppice is cut, new standards are generated. When the light comes in, new regeneration occurs. So we have 4 coppice cycles over 100-year cycle of a standard. The blue curve underneath is the hypothetical lifespan of a worker or a manager in this environment. And their career is overlapped by the next generation of people who come into this environment and work there, almost like an apprenticeship scheme. So we always have people carrying on the work of their predecessors, but learning directly from them in the environment that they're expected to manage. The large purple curve represents long-term external trends, like, for example, climate or economics. And when we have these long-term changes occurring in the wider world, we need to be able to respond to them. And it's only through this interaction, this intergenerational continuity of management and the interaction of the people with the resource that they're managing, that they are actually able to respond to these long-term changes, because there's always knowledge coming from the past into the future. And when the change occurs, especially at a dramatic period, there's at least one generation of human being able to understand how to adapt to this change. Was at the same time, there's at least one generation of tree growing that's also able to adapt to this change. A quote here from a architect who's a Pro-Silva member. Pro-Silva are a continuous cover forestry group in Europe. He said, "Valuing quality wood goes hand in hand with valuing the people who work for and with this quality. The actors in the wood industry, from the barrel to the finished object, all deserve consideration. They deserve social and economic recognition worthy of their know-how. Reducing wood to fibre and chipboard means reducing the craftsman to the status of a labourer. It means enlarging the mass of anonymous, unskilled workers available and interchangeable at will. We end up with the worker who places pieces in an arithmetical order, far from the art of assembly that was the foundation of the crafts. The negation of the joint means that that qualification is superfluous. The approach to knowledge has become abstract. To grasp meant to understand. It was a concept that involved all the senses. As perception is reduced to sight, our world is reduced to the virtual. Neither the wood nor the forest is virtual. Let us not confuse the interests of the moment with timeless objectives." Here's 2 examples of coppice products that are in high demand at the minute. On the left here, we have hazel thatching spars that you use for pinning down thatch on thatched roofs, and these are being imported into the UK and Ireland from Poland. So we're asking people in other countries to manage their coppice for us so that we can import the materials. why aren't we doing this ourselves? We are doing it to an extent, but the demand outweighs the supply here. And I can tell you that I've been told that these Polish hazel thatching spars are almost certainly being made by Polish prisoners for very, very low wages. And that's not a rumour. On the right here, we have English chestnut plaster laths, sweet chestnut. These are all made by hand from coppice sweet chestnut. Before we use plaster laths in buildings, before we use plaster laths, today we use plaster board, which is made out of gypsum and coated with paper. So we're now using both plaster laths and plasterboard generally get finished with another layer of plaster before it gets painted. So we're demanding gypsum in the form of plasterboard and also the paper coating on the plasterboard, which comes from conifer plantations, pulp from conifer plantations, instead of actively managing our woods using the coppice system and paying local people in the rural environment to make a decent living by producing these handmade laths. So we're choosing that. We're choosing plasterboard over plaster laths, and we're choosing to use prison labour in Poland instead of employing even our own prisoners, which would be probably slightly better. So here's a map of the UK temperate rainforest zone, and you can see it covers a lot of acres here, all up the west coast. And I would like to ask, how many conifer plantations are in this zone? And if we need conifer plantations to produce wood, which we do, you know, it's a big part of the economy, but do we have to have conifer plantations to produce wood? And are those plantations in this rainforest zone actually displacing native woodland, economically and commercially viable native woodland? A quote here from the 6th century philosopher Heraclitus. Nothing endures but change. There is nothing permanent except change. All is flux. Nothing stays still. In other words, change is the fundamental state of nature, the velocity and momentum of which is both outside and inside human sphere of influence. When we choose to utilize and consume the products of sustainable organic materials, we induce a cycle of ecologically positive interdependency. If we need a resource to provide us with materials, then it is up to us to manage that resource accordingly. The built-in limits to growth of natural resources determine the carrying capacity of a society. The influx of non-renewable resources, such as the deep earth hydrocarbons, have allowed us to exist outside of the built-in limits to growth of our sustainable organic materials. In coppice woodland, we cannot harvest more than the growth increment without having a negative impact. This dictates the limit to growth of the industries that consume the wood, and therefore the limits to the economic potential of the land. Modern society has chosen to ignore these limits. Cycles in nature, such as the water cycle and the carbon cycle, are also purifying processes. These cycles are under stress due to the inability of nature to process the many endocrine disrupting toxicants that we have synthesized mainly from crude oil and insist on pumping into the natural world. The clean cycling of carbon within the limits of the environment is not detrimental to the natural world. Just a moment. Okay, so I'm now just going to show you an example of the coppice system. Hypothetical example. So this diagram shows a hypothetical coppice with standards woodland. There's 25 squares here of 1 hectare in size. It's to scale. So this is a 25 hectare woodland being managed on a 25-year rotation. And if I cycle through these images, You can see the lighter patches are the newly cut coppice. And as they move through, they're cutting, the coppice is maturing ahead of the coppice workers who are cutting this area. And it is also maturing behind them as well. So we have this full cycle of woodland growing up in front of and behind the people who are cutting the areas of coppice. The little green dots you can see are standards that are either left to mature or harvested when they reach their economic prime, or potentially left to become veterans as well, if you want that. These cycles of light and shade are extremely good for biodiversity, in particular flora and fauna, insect pollinated flowers, the insects that pollinate them, and the birds that follow them behind. And with this cycle, we have what is essentially, could be, in theory, an infinite loop of a sustainable resource, as long as we don't cut outside the limits of growth. Okay, that's the end of the talk.
Virtual round of applause. Thanks very much, Mike. I really didn't expect to get into prison abolitionist futures with you, Stephen, but you know I'm here for it. It's the interconnectivity of all things. Thank you, Mike. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm slightly nervous that we haven't actually got any questions yet, because everyone's been concentrating and listening, or we've got genuine woodland workers here in abundance and no one's really interested in being the focus of a question. But yeah, Angus, have you got any pre-prepared, or are we going to go freestyle? Have a think, audience, and
well, listen,
put something in the chat, or something that you loved. We'll talk about that.
I mean, I've asked a couple of questions, and I want people to think about them. You know, and one of them is like, what products do we make here that we consume that cannot be made out of native wood? And it's a serious question. Like, I'm a professional woodworker. I know how things are made out of wood. I know what's good and what isn't good about like conifers. I'm actually very pro the growing of softwoods in the UK and Ireland, because we can grow really, really high quality softwoods here. And you know, we grow fantastic quality Douglas fir and cedar and larch and Scots pine. But you know, we've developed an economy, we've developed industries that are seeking biomass, and the conifer plantation is being the way of producing that biomass. But it's never really been truly tested to see whether we can actually produce, you know, the same kind of volume that we need from the native or even broadleaf environment.
I guess, yeah, not sure what the answer to the question is, but I guess it will be species which have properties that we don't grow here, but species that are maybe coming in. So I'm thinking of your very light materials they use for making the middle of skis and things. I think even some of that, you know, stuff that was made with balsa wood is getting made with paulownia these days. So, you know, climate change and stuff making new species coming in, which could possibly be coppice as well. Eucalyptus, stuff made out of eucalyptus, all your oils and durable timbers and things. There's a lot of potential for weird and wonderful new coppice species. Probably not in the rainforest zone, further detriment to our rainforest area, but perhaps in some other more easterly provinces.
Mike, can you see the chat?
I can, yeah.
Yeah.
So I can see there's some questions here.
We've also got hands up as well. So there's hands up from Lachlan and Gary when we've had some of the questions from them.
Okay, so I'll go through some of the questions here. So Freya You've heard of short rotation coppicing on a 7-year cycle. Is this a sustainable practice or not? Yes, it is sustainable. For example, hazel, if you cut it on roughly a 7-year cycle, it's happy to be cut on that cycle. If you were to reduce the cycle length down to like 2 or 3 years, it wouldn't be happy. The feedback you would get from the tree is that it would go into a state of decline. And so that's what I mean about limits to growth. Trees have built-in limits to growth, and you can't over-harvest them. Otherwise, the feedback that you get from them is that they start to die off. So yes, it is sustainable. The only thing that isn't really sustainable about the way that we work today is that we're using power tools like chainsaws. They're not sustainable. Although, strictly speaking, even axes aren't sustainable, but that's a different story. Kat is asking, what cycle would you use for species like sycamore and alder? The cycles aren't entirely species specific. It's more about what you want to do with the wood. Sycamore and alder today, I mean, if you're coppicing for yourself, I'm assuming you'd probably be looking for a firewood supply. So you'd probably be looking to cut it maybe around 10 to 15 years, something like that. You could probably cut it a little bit younger than that if you want. So basically we grow coppice until it reaches the size that suits our end needs, and that determines the coppice cycle. Katarina is asking, how large were those coppice squares to allow standards and veterans in between? In the those images I was showing, those squares were 1 hectare, so 100 meter by 100 meter squares. And it's an artist's impression, but there were roughly 25 standards in each hectare, which is about an average amount. Basically, you could probably have a few more or a few less than that. The slide with the questions. I'll put the slide with the questions up in a minute. Yes, the lichens that don't do so well with the sudden changes in coppicing, that's true. However, I think there are also quite a lot of assumptions being made especially by lichenologists, because, you know, in some cases they're claiming that they're finding lichens and bryophytes on hazel and saying that the hazel has never been coppiced. And I've looked at the photographs that they're showing, and I'm, as a coppice worker, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of like the Atlantic hazelwoods, and I like the fact that they're also left alone as well, and I like the biodiversity there. But I don't think that you can assume that they've never been coppiced, because you have to bear in mind that the countryside used to be much more densely populated, and wood was much more valuable, and cutting of hazel in particular was extremely common historically. So perhaps they haven't been coppiced in 200 years, 400 years maybe even, but that doesn't mean that they've never been coppiced. And if that's the case, then that means that the lichens and the bryophytes can actually recolonize those sites. And although it might be dramatic, generally speaking, when you cut an area of coppice, you don't cut every single tree in the woodland. You subdivide the woodland into areas, into coops, and often there are outliers of trees there that just don't even get cut at all. So what we don't really know is how long it takes for lichens to recolonize coppice woodland in the Atlantic rainforest zone. And like I've heard some of the lichenologists talk about 50 to 80 years since coppicing occurred, and the lichens still aren't back. Well, that's fair enough, and I'm not disputing that, but that's not a very long length of time, actually. Like, it is in a human lifetime, but it's not in the ecological sense. That's actually a very short length of time. And what's wrong with it taking a long time for those lichens to recolonize? If they do recolonize, does it matter how long they take, as long as they don't become extinct? And I don't think they ever would become extinct, because where did they come from in the first place? When you ask those questions and try to answer them, you realize how complex the subject is. Okay.
Mike, can I just come in on the lichen very briefly?
Yeah.
Is it Katharina or Katharina? Yeah, with my other hat on, I work for the Ancient Tree Forum, and we're going to be publishing a paper in the next few months, just an informal paper, not a scientific paper, about halo guidance for ancient veteran trees. So that might be of interest, and also thinking about responses in tree time and veteran tree time, which may well be similar to lichen time. And we did get somebody from some lichenologists to look at the paper, so you might be interested to keep an eye out for that.
No,
okay,
I think it's a great question. I think I've written that in the chat as well. Cheers, Claire. Obviously, we've got to understand that lots of our richest temperate rainforest in Cumbria was industrially managed, and coppicing was definitely a big part of that. And whether, if that had never happened, there would be far more biodiversity there or not, I guess we won't know. But what we do know is that the woodlands that are there because they were industrially managed, and if they weren't, then there would be a sheep pasture or a village or whatever else.
I'm going to go on with some more questions here. So Simon Mascry is talking about the native species versus conifers. Most coppice woods are unmanaged. Yeah. The decline in coppice management is nothing to do with the rise of softwood plantations. It is, because the industry basically switched almost overnight from broadleaf hardwoods into softwoods through the 20th century in response to the timber shortages during the First World War. So they then displaced, and in some cases physically displaced, ancient woodland coppice sites. So there is definitely a connection between the two things. And that was a political and economic decision, an industrial decision, not a social or cultural one, and definitely not an ecological decision. And yes, we can definitely have both. When it comes to things like yield classes, yield class is all about volume. It's not necessarily about quality. And so yield classes are about cashing in on biomass, in terms of just getting X number of tons per acre or whatever it is. Even if you're just going to end up turning that into toilet roll, they don't care. It's just about volume. It's not about quality. And if we don't have as high yield class with hardwoods, then that means we would need more tree cover to get the same amount of wood. And we want more tree cover, right? So that would actually benefit us. And then I just want to then just skip forward to Mike Walwork. How's it going, Mike? You're then asking, you've heard that UK grown softwoods are not such high quality due to the warm climate. But are high quality when they're managed well. The problem with the softwood industry is that, again, it's all about yield class rather than quality. Yield class does not mean quality, it means volume. And so when you actually switch to a thinning system, like what is now called continuous cover forestry, they would actually basically slow down the growth rate a bit and improve the quality of the logs in order to produce much, much higher quality logs. Those logs can also be made into low quality end products. You know, you can pulp it if you want, but you can also make very high quality things out of it as well. You can't make high quality end products out of low quality wood, but you can make low quality end products out of high quality wood. So the switch into continuous cover forestry shows that we can produce very high quality softwood. And I fully support that as well. Francesca's asking, how do we make it affordable to buy UK-made items? Yeah, difficult question, because the cost of living is high here, especially compared to even Eastern Europe, which isn't that far away. It's a difficult subject, this, and it's connected to so many other elements of society and the economy that we can't make things more affordable very easily without affecting other aspects of society. It's very difficult, and I can tell you as a coppice worker and a craftsperson, like the demographic of my customer base is middle class people with gardens, and I just have to accept that at this point in time. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be keeping these skills alive, because economies go in cycles, and there are going to be big changes coming in the future, and traditional crafts and traditional land management techniques are going to become a lot more important in the future. So we need to find a way of surviving. And if that means that you're making what is essentially a luxury product for people in the time being, then so be it. That's what we have to do. It's a difficult subject, that, and I don't have an answer for that question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole unpicking of quite a big system that we're living in. Lachlan's asked a very specific question, which points in the same direction, which you might want to pick up on, Mike.
Yeah.
But I would sort of argue that, similar to our food system, really, whatever we're paying, however unfair and unequal it is, we're not actually paying how much something costs, because we're not factoring in the human cost to a product, whether it's food or whether it's a wood product, or the cost to the earth. So everything's pretty wonky at the moment. And I agree, Mike, it is a shame that most of the products that we're advocating for here, we probably couldn't afford to use in our own lives or purchase. But go on, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, Lachlan's question here is, do you think it would be economic for a craft worker with a small woodland to compete with B&Q on skirting boards? No. You can't compete with massive industries. That's kind of what mechanization is about. Mechanization and automation are actually synonymous with unemployment. Like, that's what they've done. They've made craftspeople unemployed. So you get what you pay for, basically. I wouldn't even consider competing with B&Q. I don't even think about it.
Well, because what I also mentioned in the question was that someone on LinkedIn had worked out that a £17 bit of skirting board equated to £5,000 a cubic meter. So that's a lot of value. If you've got a cubic meter of softwood and you turn it into skirting boards, like surely there's enough in that. So I can't do the maths, but that feels like a lot of value per cubic meter.
It is a lot of value, and it's excessive, actually. You could get it cheaper than that. I wouldn't buy skirting board from B&Q personally, because it's expensive there. but also like you're talking about an end product versus the raw material, and raw materials are much cheaper than their end products. So you can't compare the end product, especially in a retail environment like B&Q, which is catering to home DIY people. That's not even commercial builders merchants, where it's probably a bit cheaper. And it's definitely not the sawmill, because you could buy those boards from a sawmill and air dry them at home and make your own skirting board, and it'd be way cheaper. So B&Q is a bad example of everything, because it's like the Tesco's of the hardware world. So like, and the markup on that for them, how much do you think that 17 quid board is costing B&Q?
Yeah, thank you, and love the presentation, by the way. Thanks very much.
Hiya. Yeah, just coming back really. Obviously, you replied to my comment there. I think I do still feel that it's a shame to sort of portray coppice versus softwood in this way, because as a forester, I'm involved in coppice management, hazel. I cut hazel myself. I'm fully on board with managing more of our own coppice and getting sort of local coppice products back into the local economy. But still, we need more softwoods, because the important thing is we import 80% of our timber. So we should get away from this softwood versus hardwood argument, because it's not the issue. The issue is that we're importing 80% of our timber. And again, I think I do still feel that you're trying to blame the softwood industry and the conifer plantations for the demise of coppice, and it really isn't the case. Yes, there's certain examples where traditional coppice woods were sort of transformed to conifer plantations, but that's not the reason for the demise in coppice management, because certainly where I am in the south of England, we're surrounded by completely unmanaged hazel coppice. So we can have the two, and there's just such a kind of negative viewpoint being sort of expounded towards our timber industry at the moment from sort of all angles, and I think that's a shame, because let's focus on sort of managing coppice and getting coppice back into management, but that doesn't mean that we have to sort of point fingers at the softwood industry as well, because you can have a lot more. We could meet our domestic demand for coppice products by just getting unmanaged coppice back into production, without that in any way pointing a negative finger at the softwood industry. So yeah, just coming back on that point really.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and I do agree with you. But like, if you read about the history of what happened there, especially through the 20th century, softwoods were supported to the detriment of broadleaves, and that was a political decision. And I think that's also what led to the decline of the coppice industry. So it's not necessarily the people involved in the softwood industry today, but there is, there were historical maneuvers made to push society away from traditional land management and into mechanized land management. And the softwood industry, it made sense to grow conifers, because they take such little intervention to still retain their leading shoot. That's actually why they grow them. Whereas broadleaves are very different, as you know. It's a difficult subject. Like I said, I'm pro growing of softwoods. I just want really high quality ones. I don't really agree with spruce plantations being used as biomass. I think it's a very weird thing to do. And like, I would actually rather, if we were going to, you know, make that wood into pulp, I'd rather that we were actually restoring our coppice woods and making that into pulp, because I think that would actually be better use. So, you know, it's a complex subject, and it contains a lot of different elements.
Yeah,
like,
I think
yeah.
I think you're right there when you said that there was a lot of you know, sort of regulatory push towards softwoods, which definitely skewed things. You know, during the 20th century, the grant aid and the tax sort of incentives were all towards softwood plantations. But now it's swung the other way, and it's all the sort of public finance and public pressure is towards fluffy broadleaves, and often, I'm afraid, not even productive broadleaves. People don't even seem to care whether it's a productive coppice or whether it's just a sort of unmanaged squirrel fodder. So, you know, we saw the pendulum swing one way, all towards let's have softwoods, and now it's swinging back towards the other way of like, oh, we don't like softwoods, let's have fluffy broadleaves. And what we really need to get away from is this dichotomy of softwood versus hardwood, and go, let's have a bit of sensible balance, and let's have both. And I hear it all the time, this sort of softwood versus hardwood argument, and it just grates with me, because it's like, right, let's have both, and let's do both well.
Thanks, Simon. That seems like a nice place. And
I think Gary's been champing at the bit all evening.
Go on,
I think
Gary.
we should maybe let him.
I appreciate that, Angus, and cheers, Claire. Yeah, I just wanted, I think there's a couple of points there I'd like to try and see if I could neatly try and pull together, because I feel like we're all talking around the same topic, and I think we're actually aiming in the right direction. I think one of my initial thoughts and reflections was what was different in the past, and what would need to change to see the changes I think we ought to see in the future. I think it's particularly interesting in that context of saying we did in the past have this in an economy that functioned in a countryside that allowed land workers to work on smaller scale woodlands to generate economic return that would give fair livelihoods to people. I think the reality is we don't live in that world now, and without sort of massive societal upheaval and taking to the streets and all those other bits and bobs, it's likely going to stay that way for the next couple of decades. And I think, so in that, how do we create that change that we want to see? I think it particularly comes back to you talking about quality, and you talking about sort of generating high quality softwoods, where we're talking about softwoods or high quality broadly. So I think it depends on, we as land managers need to define our objectives, what we're trying to achieve. I would argue that when we're spruce farming, we are achieving our objectives because we're trying to generate as much biomass as possible. We successfully, for right or wrong, achieve what we want to do. And I wonder whether we should always be framing the conversations about what's right for whatever space around what are we trying to achieve, and does that fit within, you know, our values as an individual and our regulatory framework as a member of an organized society. I think then where it becomes interesting to me is to say, well, what could be different, and how would we get there in terms of generating value from small scale products? It seems to me that the piece I resonated with most was around how we do the most processing of that idea of producing the gates for the person that, you know, can afford to in the gardens. In my own role, sort of professionally, landowners, farmers that seem to be the most financially sustainable are those that are doing the most of their products before it's going to market. So rather than selling milk by the tanker, they're turning it into, those I know me, cheese and ice cream. That is generating more sustainability. So it feels to me like a diversification of skills is required for individuals that are working with land, owning land, to be able to generate the greatest value from their own materials rather than selling it at 20 quid a ton, for someone to then put it in B&Qs and sell it for whatever it was, £5,000 equivalent of it. That
Yeah,
was
thanks.
my mini rant.
No, no,
for
I
giving me the
like.
opportunity.
I'm supportive of your mini rant. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I think we're all basically pointing in the right direction, but struggling to work within the systems that are out of our control. But it sounds like we would all like to see people valued better, people who work in the woods and everybody else. We'd like to heal the severance in understanding the cultural severance between people and land and what the land produces, and value that better. It'd be nice to find a way to take care of the land, take care of the people, and take care of the nature, instead of putting the nature over there and paying the land managers to manage it for nature, whilst importing thatching laths from a prison in Poland. Really grateful for all of your contributions and your company this evening. Appreciate you, especially if you've been on the computer all day. So thanks so much for turning up, and thanks for your energy. Mike, excellent talk, excellent fielding of questions. Thank you so much. And thanks again to Cumbrian Woodlands and the Plant-Life Rainforest Project. And we'll see you at the next event. There'll be a reading list which will come out from Mike in the next few days in an email to say thanks for attending, and maybe a document as well from Plant-Life. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good night.